Good afternoon, and welcome to the opening session of the 2025 ACS National Convention Series, a 4-week series of virtual programming and networking opportunities presented by the American Constitution Society. I'm Zanelle October, Interim President of ACS, the nation's leading progressive legal network with over 200 student and lawyer chapters in almost every state and law school around the country. Through our diverse, rapidly growing nationwide network of progressive lawyers, law students, judges, scholars, advocates, and many others, ACS supports and advocates for laws and legal systems that strengthen our democratic legitimacy, uphold the rule of law, and realize the promise of equality for all. If you haven't already, I'd encourage you to become a member of ACS and to donate. Our work is more important now than ever, and we need your support. Go to acslaw.org, where you can join, donate, and find more information about events like this one. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our sponsors for making the convention series and all of ACS's programming throughout the year possible. In particular, ACS would like to thank the sponsors at our underwriter level, Leif Cabraser, Kirkland Ellis, and Paul Weiss. Please see our full list of sponsors who we are very grateful to. I also want to thank our incredible staff who worked extremely hard to organize this convention series, as well as all the fantastic work they do daily. It has been less than 5 months since Donald Trump took the oath of office and began his second term as President of the United States. In that time, we have seen unrelenting attacks on democratic institutions, civil rights, and the very constitutional order that serves as the foundation of the rule of law in the United States. Many of us may have thought we knew what to expect from this administration based on what happened during Trump's first term. But little could have prepared us for the myriad ways in which this administration has so quickly run roughshod over the rule of law. The litany of egregious actions taken by this administration are familiar to most of us. Attacking free and fair elections, undermining and perverting anti-discrimination laws and principles of equal protection to harm marginalized communities, enriching political cronies and doubling down on governance by oligarchy at the expense of the most in need of government support, and subverting due process to punish perceived political enemies and undertake cruel attacks on immigrant communities. All of this and more are being done under the Trump administration's ahistorical claim of expansive executive power. This administration is acting as though the judiciary and Congress are subservient rather than co-equal branches of government. The events we are witnessing in our nation are alarming and dispiriting. They warrant examination, dissection, and discussion. But that is not enough. We must engage in creative problem solving. We must look to the advocates, activists, and everyday people working in states and communities throughout the country to resist authoritarianism and create opportunities for progress locally that we can learn from nationally. That is why this convention series is designed to examine what can and is being done at the state and local level in the face of abuses of power this country has not experienced in generations, if ever. Each week in June, we are featuring discussions that provide the context to understand the threats we are facing in areas like voting and elections, the rights of transgender people, economic justice, and immigration, coupled with an on-the-ground view from community advocates, elected officials, and public servants. The goal of this convention series is not just to inform attendees about the challenges we face, but to empower each and every one of you to find your voice, find your community, and help us find solutions to the challenges we face through engagement with allies in your own community, including within ACS's many student and lawyer chapters. To kick off our series, I'm delighted to now turn things over to ACS Senior Director of Policy and Program, Lindsay Langholz, who will lead today's discussion about the ways in which we can combat anti-democratic power grabs at the state level and what the path forward looks like to restore checks and balances at all levels of government. Lindsay?
Thank you, Zanelle. Welcome, and thank you everyone so much for joining us for Power Plays. As Zanelle mentioned, over the next several weeks, our convention series panels will be taking a critical look at the chaotic and in many times traumatic effects of our current federal political environment. With an administration openly hostile to constitutional rights and the rule of law, a Congress unwilling to wrest back its own authority, and a Supreme Court in the throes of a legitimacy crisis of its own making, many progressives are turning their attention and efforts to state-based work. State courts and state constitutional protections have been critically important to abortion rights advocates in the aftermath of Dobbs, just to give one example. But of course, progressives aren't the only group interested in this turn to the states. Record-breaking amounts of money have flooded state elections, and a series of United States Supreme Court decisions have opened the doors wide to gerrymandering run amok. The focus of today's panel will be how power is being concentrated and centralized in state legislatures, and how those legislatures are wielding that power. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. To receive CLE for this program, you will need to submit 2 codes, which I'll provide during the program, once at the beginning and once in the middle. Please write down these codes. You will enter them into the Google form that is available on the ACS convention page under the CLE tab. If you need help with CLE, you can email convention@acslaw.org. I'll give the first code now, and that is POODLE, Poodle. There will be time during today's discussion for audience questions. To submit a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Do not use the chat to ask your questions, as we will not be monitoring it, and your question will not be read or put in the queue. If you are a member of the press, please include the name of your outlet at the beginning of your question. After today's panel discussion, those who are interested can stick around for an interactive talkback with panelists, ACS staff, and other attendees. This afternoon's discussion is being recorded, and the recording will be available on ACS's website after today's program concludes. However, the talkback sessions will not be recorded. Okay, with all of that sorted, let me briefly introduce our esteemed panelists. Michael Lee is Senior Counsel in the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. He uses he, him pronouns. Dawn Blagrove is the Executive Director and Attorney at Emancipate, North Carolina. She uses she, her pronouns. And Derek Klinger is a Senior Staff Attorney with the State Democracy Research Initiative at the University of Wisconsin Law School. He uses he, him pronouns. Their full bios with links to their organizations are available on our convention page, and I highly encourage you to seek them out, as each has done incredible work in this space, and we could fill the entire hour giving their full resumes. But we have real important things to discuss. So Michael, I would love to start with you. In this turn to the states, many are taking their first hard look at the composition and power of state legislatures and how gerrymandered many have become. How did this happen, and what effect has it had?
So when it comes to gerrymandering, there's good news and there's bad news. And in the interest of ending on the good news, I'll start with the bad news. So gerrymandering, which is to say the manipulation of political electoral districts to lock in a particular partisan outcome, is something that has been with us since the beginning of the Republic. Even the founding generation was not above it. Patrick Henry of Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death fame also was governor of Virginia at the time the state was drawing its very first congressional map, and tried to draw that map in a way that a man named James Madison could not win election to Congress. And so even the founding generation was willing to sort of engage in shenanigans, and he was unsuccessful. But in the intervening 250 years, both Democrats and Republicans and Whigs and whatever party exists at the time have been willing to sort of pick up the sword if they are able to, and to try to do gerrymandering. And it's a little bit like like Gollum, like the Ring and Lord of the Rings, right? If it's there, you have the ability to use it. It's almost too good to tear down. But the bad news is that in a lot of ways, gerrymandering is becoming more prevalent and also more pernicious. And there are several reasons for this. So the first really is the rise of, it's very simple. It's the rise of single party control of the redistricting process. If you go back to 1992, right after the or 1991, 1992, right after the 1990 census, there were 18 states where one party controlled the entirety of the process by controlling the governor's mansion and both houses of the legislature. Um, since then, in the intervening 3 decades, that really has grown quite a bit. In the most recent round of redistricting after the 2020 census, there were 32 states where one party had sole control of the process. And those both include states where legislatures draw maps, or in some cases, states where you have a body that is like in Arkansas, where it's all Republican statewide elected officials. And so, and the reality is that from decades of observations, we know that the single biggest predictor of whether a state will have problematic maps is whether you have single party control of the redistricting process. It just that is that's not to say that when you have divided government that they draw perfect maps. There's plenty of incumbent protection and other sorts of insider horse trading that goes on when you have divided governments. But what divided governments don't do is that they don't draw maps that skew wildly in favor of one party or the other, right? They draw much more balanced maps. And that's either because divided government means you have to compromise with the other party, or it means that you deadlock. And if you deadlock, then a court or a special master gets appointed to draw the maps. And courts also don't draw the perfect maps. They're oftentimes very reluctant to make changes, but they typically, with some exception, typically do not draw maps that wildly skew in favor of one party or the other. The second reason that gerrymandering really has grown a lot is that the country is changing, and there are many places where you under if you had fairly drawn maps would have a lot of competition, and that threatens people who are in power. We oftentimes, if you listen to political pundits, they oftentimes talk about how we sorted ourselves into red America and blue America, and there's nothing in between. And that's true in some places, right? But it's not true in a big chunk of the country, which are the suburbs, right? The suburbs of the country where 55% of all Americans now live. To go back 2 decades, only 45% of Americans lived in the suburbs. Now 55% of us do. And the suburbs, if you look at a political map, they're light pink, they're light blue, oftentimes very purplish. And even if one party has an advantage in the suburbs, it's not a particularly large advantage, and the suburbs, and as we've seen in recent elections, have swung back and forth between the parties more than other parts of the country. And so, and if you have that, then you would naturally think that you would have, a lot of competition, and that is very threatening to people. And it's also important to realize that the suburbs have become much more diverse. If you listen to President Trump talk about the suburbs, he has a very 1950s image of what the suburbs were. But the reality is that in the country's metro areas now, a majority of people of color in the country's metro areas now live in the suburbs, not in the core cities. Take Gwinnett County outside of Atlanta in the 1990s, it was 67% white. It's only 30% white now. It's very diverse. It's 28% Black, 24% Latino, 14% Asian. And that replicates itself across the country, but especially in the boom states of the South. And that creates political risk. And it's especially in battleground states, and it's worth noting that some of the worst gerrymandering happens in states that are purple, like North Carolina or Wisconsin, where because you don't really have to gerrymander in Wyoming, you don't have to gerrymander in Brooklyn, New York, where I live. I live in a state assembly district where Barack Obama got 98% of the vote and Hillary Clinton got 96% of the vote. Like, if you draw a district where I live, no matter how you draw it, it will be a Democratic district. But there are places like North Carolina, Wisconsin, the battleground states, where you really do see a need to sort of put your thumb on the scale. And the third reason, and I'll close with this, is the courts. The Supreme Court in particular has now green-lighted partisan gerrymandering. It said that, it's not going to step in. Federal courts are not going to step in and police partisan gerrymandering. For a long time, it was unclear. The courts have wrestled with this question, and leaving that open, it has been, people, lawmakers did, even if they thought the courts are probably not going to strike this down, they weren't sure if the cop was on the beat, and so they acted a little bit more modestly than they might have otherwise. Or they had to go to extreme lengths to try to justify their partisan gerrymandering, like in North Carolina, by claiming, "Oh, we're complying with the Voting Rights Act," even though it was a completely specious sort of interpretation of the Voting Rights Act. And so now with the Supreme Court having in 2019 ruled in Rucho versus Common Cause that partisan gerrymandering is not something federal courts are going to intervene in, lawmakers have been very open about gerrymandering. And it's worth noting that that really sort of not only has political fairness implications, it also has racial fairness implications, because the reality is that you see maps around the country being justified, like in South Carolina, that discriminate heavily against voters of color. On the people just defend them on the basis of politics. Oh, well, we were just discriminating against Democrats, and they happen to be black and brown. But that we weren't discriminating against because of their race. We were just discriminating against Democrats. And so the Supreme Court has really opened that, not only with Rucho, but a series of cases that have sort of said, like, states get a presumption of good faith when they draw maps. We're not rulings that make it really hard to get beyond the legislative privilege, so lawmakers can hide things, because the reality is they don't typically go on the record and say we're discriminating against Black people, right? They don't say that out loud, at least in most places. And so to figure out what's happening, you have to sort of like get beyond the curtain, and that's very hard to do. Now, having said that, all this is bad news, there also is good news, right? And the good news comes in several forms. One is that state courts and state constitutions are increasingly being used to challenge bad maps, and with varying degrees of success. But that's a very promising thing for the future. Voters also are angry about gerrymandering in ways that they weren't like 3 or 4 decades ago, or even 2 decades ago, where people didn't understand what it was. Voters of all across party lines really do understand that this is an issue, and where they can, because where they have ballot initiatives, they are taking that into their own hands. Michigan voters created an independent commission last decade in response to gerrymandering there, and it drew very fair maps. And Michigan went from having very unfair maps to having some of the most fair maps in the country. And likewise, there are other avenues for challenging gerrymandering, including, Congress came very close to passing reforms to the Voting Rights Act and strengthening the Voting Rights Act. It came close to imposing anti-gerrymander standards for Congress. And so the fight against gerrymandering is a multi-front fight. It's always been a multi-front fight, and outside of the federal courts, those fights sort of go on, not without a certain amount of pushback from people. So, but we can talk more about that in a minute. So,
thank you so much, Michael. And obviously, these state legislatures, once they have drawn themselves the maps that they would prefer, then go about using that power. And so, Dawn, I would love to turn to you. North Carolina has been mentioned many times, and I know it will be many more. There in North Carolina, you've experienced kind of a laboratory of anti-democratic policies from the state legislature in recent years. How has it wielded its power? How's the legislature wielded its power to avoid checks and balances? And what has the experience been there on the ground?
So thank you for having me. And yeah, North Carolina is a hotbed for anti-democratic work from our state legislature and our state courts. So North Carolina typically avoids that trifecta of one party control. So we very rarely have a Republican governor, a Republican legislature, and a Republican controlled judiciary. But our Republican-led judiciary, or excuse me, legislature, which we've had for about 10 years, where they've had a supermajority or pretty close to a supermajority for quite some time, has used their power in ways to undermine the power of the governor, depending on who's in office and which party holds the governorship, and also has used gerrymandering and other electoral powers to ensure that the North Carolina courts look a certain way and swing extremely conservative. So right now, in this moment, what we're seeing is that our legislature obviously has done some nasty stuff with gerrymandering. We have some really incredibly horribly gerrymandered districts here in North Carolina, and in 2016 and 2019, those very gerrymandered maps were found unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court. However, since then, the state Supreme Court has the control of the state Supreme Court has moved over to the conservatives. And as a result, we are seeing a strong amount of, and I don't think collusion is the wrong word, between our judiciary and our legislature to steal power away from a Democratic governor and use the power of the legislature to control and to determine outcomes of many statewide elections. North Carolina is a state that is solidly purple when you look at federal elections and statewide elections. We are seeing that there are razor thin margins in those elections. However, because of the gerrymandered districts, we're seeing outsized numbers of Republicans that are guaranteed to be able to hold and maintain seats in our state legislature. And that is one of the ways that they are manipulating democracy here in North Carolina. Another way, like I've already mentioned, is limiting the power and removing power away from the governor. Right now, the North Carolina governor is a Democrat. Our last governor, his predecessor, was also a Democrat. The General Assembly here in North Carolina, however, moved to make sure that all of the governor's cabinet positions now have to be confirmed by the legislature. So they all have to have hearings, which is not something that happened before. They've moved appointment powers for the State Board of Elections away from the governor and put it back into the hands of the state legislature. And they have also done some really nasty things around appointment of judicial vacancies, taking that away from the governor and made it in a way, well, not taking it away from him exactly, but have curtailed it to the point where the governor has virtually no real control over who fills vacant judicial seats. All of these things, especially when you consider that we have a state judiciary and a legislature that are colluding to reduce the checks and balances on each of those three systems, what you end up with is a highly undemocratic state, and a place where political power is being very highly concentrated among one political party, which uses that power and the power of the people in a way that is blatantly racist, blatantly homophobic, blatantly misogynistic. And we see that come up over and over again in the way that these legislators and our judiciaries move. Lastly, what we've seen is very not unconstitutional, but they have been deemed unconstitutional measures to limit access to the ballot come out of our General Assembly under the preceding court that was a more progressive North Carolina General Assembly. We had unfair gerrymandered districts struck down. We had voter ID struck down. We had limitations on early voting struck down as unconstitutional. And we also had a court that granted over 65,000 people in North Carolina who had previous felony convictions, gave them access to the ballot. With the new administration that came in, the new court that came in 2023, not only did they actively and aggressively go back and revisit those decisions, they overturned and upset standing law and precedents that in a way that was just so blatantly racist. And we also see we only have one Black woman who sits on the North Carolina Supreme Court, Justice Anita Earls, who last year faced a vicious attack through the use of the Judicial Ethics Committee to try to get her unseated. We also saw, and the whole world watched, as North Carolina was the last state to close our elections with the Supreme Court race here for our state Supreme Court between Jefferson Griffin and Allison Riggs, who was the incumbent. But Griffin challenged the 708 odd votes that he lost this election by in ways that was blatantly racist. He targeted high numbers of Black voters, high numbers of youth voters, and challenged the validity of their votes. Ironically, though, not in all elections in North Carolina, only in that particular contest, which I think is indicative of the freeness with which our state legislature and our state judiciary is moving in a way that is, like I said, initially blatantly racist, with the intent to centralize power among a very small group of white men and hold it there indefinitely. So those are some of the things that we're seeing here in North Carolina.
Thank you. And I want to bring Derek into the conversation now, because I think for so many people who've been experiencing these types of anti-democratic measures, whether it be at the state or the federal level, there's an instinct of, well, let's take it directly to the people. Let's use these direct democracy measures to try and provide a check against some of these power grabs. Derek, how has that actually played out in recent years? What has that been looking like?
Yeah, well, first, thank you, Lindsay, Zanelle, and ACS for having me today. It's a real honor to be on the panel with Michael and Don. I mean, just taking a step back real quick, about half the states have some form of statewide direct democracy power. These powers include the constitutional initiative, which allows citizens to propose state constitutional amendments directly to their fellow voters. The statutory initiative, which allows citizens to propose state laws directly to their fellow voters, and the veto referendum, which allows citizens to directly approve or reject a law passed by the legislature. And then, like you said, these powers are meant as a check on elected officials, and especially state legislatures. The basic idea is that if elected officials do something that the people don't want them to do, or if elected officials fail to do something that the people do want them to do, then there'd be this mechanism in place to allow voters to put the policy directly before their fellow citizens. But how have these powers played out? I'd say it's been kind of messy, especially in recent years. A lot of these direct democracy powers have been in place for about 100 years or so. They came out of the progressive era from the late 19th century and early 20th century. And while these powers were pretty heavily used at first, interest in them on the whole kind of died down over the years. But if you go back about a decade or so now, there's been a pretty clear trend of citizens using direct democracy powers to pass or to attempt to pass progressive aligned policies in red and purple states. This includes minimum wage increases, Medicaid expansion, marijuana legalization, redistricting reform, voting rights protections, and of course, since the Dobbs decision a few years ago, which overturned Roe v. Wade, like of the initiative power to enshrine reproductive rights in state constitutions. We saw this in Michigan in 2022, Ohio in 2023, and then in 2024, there were, by my count, I think 9 abortion-related initiated ballot measures, plus a few others that had been put on the ballot by state legislatures. And most of those passed, including measures in like the red and purple states of Arizona, Missouri, Montana, Nevada. Others came very close, like in Nebraska, there was a dueling measure on the ballot, and in Florida, where the state constitution requires a 60% supermajority for approval instead of the more typical simple majority vote, and the measure came just short of that. I think what these results show is that the citizens' direct democracy powers do remain this powerful tool for the people to go around, hostile elected representatives and adopt or enact public policies that enjoy public support. But where things get messy, it's coinciding with this rise in these progressive aligned ballot measures. There's been a backlash from legislators in those same states where they're seeking to make these processes harder. So rather than just attempting to win the public policy debates that are raised by initiatives and referenda, officials have engaged in really an all-out assault on these processes. They've targeted almost every aspect. This includes attempts to impose signature requirements that are nearly impossible to meet, supermajority approval requirements, kind of like what Florida has, onerous registration requirements for circulators, mandatory reviews by other officials that can just lead to lengthy delays, wording requirements that affect how the proposals are framed to the voters. We're seeing all sorts of different things. Just in the first half of this year, we've seen proposals like these in Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Montana, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Utah. I mean, it's just really everywhere that has these powers. And another thing, and perhaps even more surprising than these restrictions, is we've also seen legislatures just flatly seeking to undermine or even completely undo initiated measures that were approved by the voters. Missouri provides a few examples of this. Last November, voters approved an initiated statute that increased the state's minimum wage and provided guarantees for paid sick leave. But just a few weeks ago, only about 6 months after the election, the state legislature repealed the paid sick leave requirement, along with part of the minimum wage increase. And another example, at the same election, Missouri voters also approved an initiated constitutional amendment that protects access to abortion. But the legislature has already voted to submit to the voters a new constitutional amendment that would essentially repeal what the voters just approved. So that'll be on the ballot in 2026, I believe. And there's similar rollbacks working their way through other state legislatures. Arizona, where over 60% of the voters just approved an initiated constitutional amendment to protect abortion access. Some bills are already moving through to restrict medication abortions and block funds for healthcare centers that discuss abortion with their patients. In Nebraska, the legislators are working to weaken a paid sick leave ballot measure that was approved by nearly 75% of the vote in November. According to some testimony, that those changes could result in more than 30,000 Nebraskans losing paid sick leave. And something I've written about in Ohio, the legislature is on the brink of dramatically overhauling a 2023 initiated statute that legalized marijuana. It looks like legislators have probably backed down from their initial threats to fully repeal the measure. There's a real chance that they're going to seek to criminalize or recriminalize activities kind of associated with legalization. And so getting back to your original question, Lindsay, I mean, these direct democracy powers do exist in about half the states. It's a very powerful check on state legislatures. But what we're increasingly seeing is that rather than kind of accepting the will of the people, legislatures are fighting back.
I want to turn us next to progressives and what we can take these lessons and maybe use them and move forward with them. But first, I need to give the second CLE code. So the second CLE code is BEAGLE, B-E-A-G-L-E. You may notice a theme in today's code words. So with that taken care of, I'm going to throw this open to the group and just ask, given that states are actually ahead of the federal government in some ways in these kind of anti-democratic experimentation and moves. What are we learning at the state level? And if there is something to be learned to apply to the federal level, what might that be?
I'll start. I think what we're seeing here in North Carolina is that what we're learning is that people have a basic and fundamental misunderstanding of most of these processes, who and what powers these elected officials hold and how they can use that power. So in North Carolina, we have worked very hard as a statewide coalition around raising awareness of the community. We do that around, we have held innumerable public trainings around the importance of the role of the judiciary, what the judiciary does, and how it impacts people's lives. We have raised awareness around gerrymandering, what that looks like, try to demystify the concept so that people understand what they're seeing when they see it. In North Carolina, we have a really strong collaborative communications plan that we use the media in a way to help educate, but that we're also holding conferences. We just did a conference called In Our Courts, again, around the importance of the judiciary and how the judiciary can and should be the gatekeepers to protect democracy in our state. We found that that is resounding with people, and that people are responding in ways that we have not seen them respond, and being engaged in ways we haven't seen them respond. We've also been, we live in a time now where traditional rules just aren't being followed, right? The rules of civil and civic engagement in the body politic have changed in ways that are virtually unrecognizable for most folks. And so what I find is that what we've found here in North Carolina is that many progressives have not adapted well enough to that seismic change in the way that the game is being played. Here in North Carolina, though, I feel like we have done a really incredible job of learning how to very quickly color outside of the lines, to say out loud the quiet parts that nobody else wants to say out loud. And specifically, I want to point to the work that was done around the state Supreme Court race and the challenges to the state Supreme Court race. Typically, we would write letters and do all the traditional things. This time around, though, we really took it to the people. We had multiple rallies across the state that were incredibly well attended. We spoke to the people about how what was happening in this election was indicative of a broader erosion of democracy, and that if we allowed this to happen in this particular race, then we would open the door for actually the demise of democracy. And people have responded in a way, the people have responded in a way that has been overwhelming to those non-traditional ways and methods of garnering public support and using their power in ways, the people, I mean, using their powers in ways that are non-traditional, calling judges and saying, listen, I know that you can't take into consideration what I'm saying, but I'm going to say it to you anyways. We see what you're doing. We know that you're trying to take us back to Jim Crow. We're not going to do it. We're not going to go back. And what we found is that when we call out racist and misogynistic behaviors in full-throated, very clear layman's language, that it resonates with people, people understand it, and then people are seriously outraged. And one of the things that we focus, and most folks who are doing activist work focus on, is the fact that the power that elected officials have is not a power that is derivative from them or from the position. It is directly derivative from the people, and that it is our power. And what they do with our power is of consequence to us, that they respond to us, that they work for us, and that if we are not using our power and our voices in ways to bring them back in line with the majority sense of what the body politic should look like in our state, that there will be repercussions. We have found that here in North Carolina to be strongly effective. Now, we are still fighting wicked uphill battles, but we are, we can point to the North Carolina Supreme Court race where Jefferson Griffin finally conceded after months and months and months of litigation. But we do believe that most of that, that a lot of that came from public pressure on the party, public pressure on him individually. And that was public pressure that was created by the people understanding the power that they have in the political process. So that is one thing that I think we can talk about as far as what we need to do to push back and to recapture and to not only recapture our power, but redirect the power that we've given to elected officials and people in power in our judiciaries, to make sure that they understand that their job is to uphold our wants, our wishes, our needs, and that when they don't, we have to make it uncomfortable for them in ways that is not always traditional.
I would just add on to that I think at this moment, like, it's important to be creative and sometimes think outside the box, right? That there are oftentimes more tools than you think that you have. And the one that I always point to is like state constitutions, right? Which we as lawyers are all trained like, oh, if your rights are being violated, go to the federal constitution, go to federal courts. But that has not been as fruitful a path in recent years. But there's a lot in state constitutions. State constitutions are longer than the federal constitution. They're amended much more often. And they have a panoply of rights that have no federal analog. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court struck down a gerrymandered congressional map using the state's free and fair elections clause, which dates back to the 18th century. In fact, predates the federal constitution. And likewise, in Utah, you've seen a very conservative Utah Supreme Court say no, like when the legislature tried to gut redistricting reforms passed by voters in 2018, the Utah Supreme Court said, like, no, you don't have free reign to do that. There are limits to that. And that was, going to, again, a court that, on paper you might not think is amenable to that, but is willing to sort of like do the checks and balances and thing. You know, likewise in Wisconsin, people took a very boring provision, a continuity requirement that districts be, contiguous, and we're able to use that to leverage much fairer maps. And so Wisconsin goes from having maps where Democrats really have no chance of winning a majority to maps where now they do have a chance in the right election cycle. So I think it's incumbent on us as lawyers to like kind of like think about all of the tools that are there and not just sort of say like, well, gosh, there's nothing that we can do now. Of course, a lot depends on courts and as Don talked about, the North Carolina Supreme Court has become much more seemingly partisan in it, sort of the way that it approaches issues, but that's not the case everywhere. And I think there's a lot out there that we can use, and it's incumbent on us, especially in states that are suffering from some of these things, to try to do that.
Yeah, and to Michael's point about state constitutions, I just want to quickly plug a wonderful resource my organization has put together called 50 Constitutions. It's the number 50constitutions.org. It's a publicly searchable database of every state constitution. If you're curious, how many states have a provision on, free and equal elections clauses, you can just type in free and equal elections clauses and it all pops up. So it's a really wonderful resource. But a major lesson I see for anyone using direct democracy powers, and I do see threads of this also in Michael and Don's remarks, is that the fight, so to speak, might go well beyond the election. What we're seeing in places like Missouri, Arizona, Nebraska, and Ohio, that an initiative could be approved by the voters by a double-digit margin, yet state officials who unsuccessfully oppose the measure might still look for ways to undermine the measures. This could be through legislative changes to the measure, placing competing measures on the ballot, or even just dragging their feet when it comes to enforcing what the voters approved. So, based on these experiences, I imagine initiative proponents will probably just need to do more to plan for these kind of post-election follow-through phase.
It's such an important point, and I want to circle back to something that's happened in North Carolina. Don, you referenced the election that just recently was resolved, even though voters went to the polls months before. Even after that has resolved itself, the state legislature said, well, we're not out of this game. We're a full-time shop over here and trying to throw things at folks. And orchestrated kind of an overtaking of the state's election board. And so, Derek, to your point, the state legislatures are working on this round the clock. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing is that democracy has always been a participatory sport, but I think that even more so than maybe even in my lifetime or in other folks' lifetime, it is a year-round commitment to do this work and to try and push back on some of these, anti-democratic and at times authoritarian measures that we're seeing. Are there tips or encouragements that you might have for folks as they start to engage with that process, perhaps, as they start to move beyond just voting and think about how they want to get involved and working towards pushing back on some of these?
So absolutely. I think that, and I'm sorry, I wanted to jump on this one because this is kind of close to my heart. So we have got to have a whole paradigm shift around what voting means and what it means to be a good citizen, right? So often we think about voting as a transactional situation, which is also why so many, we find that it is so hard to overcome voter apathy, because for so long we have talked about voting as though it were transactional. If you vote for this person, this thing will happen. If you vote for this person, this thing will change in your life. And I think that what we have found, especially now more than ever in American politics, is that simply just is not true for the most marginalized people in our communities, and often for even the majority in our communities. So we have got to start talking to people about their responsibility as a voter going beyond just the ballot box. Oftentimes I do lectures at universities and in communities, and I liken your responsibility as a voter to being a hiring employer. What do I mean? I mean that the campaign season is the interview process, right? And then we vote and we decide who we're going to pick which candidate is the best. So we're going to pick the person that we give the job to. And so often we believe that that is where our role as citizens ends. But when you think about it as a hiring process, who of us has ever gotten a job where you've been hired and interviewed extensively, gotten a job, and then the person who hires you says, now do whatever you want to do. We're not going to give you any directions. We're not going to follow up. We're not going to see if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. We have, as citizens of America, been conditioned to believe that that's the way voting works, and it doesn't. We have got to make sure that people understand that once you hire these people, even if the candidate that you picked didn't get elected, didn't get the job, you still have a responsibility to make sure that that onboarding and that on-the-job training and that those review assessments are happening throughout the tenure of them holding that office. That is what people need to be doing, and that is the way we are really, especially with Emancipate NC as we do community organizing, it's really about orienting people to what their job is as employers of these folks. These people work for you, and we say that all the time, but then we never ask for people to take on the accountability and responsibility that comes with being an employer of elected officials. What that means is they don't know how well they're doing or how poorly they're doing if they don't hear from you. Right? If they don't see you, if you don't tell them what you want, they have every opportunity to say, well, we didn't know. So we encourage people to go to the General Assembly, speak at committee hearings. We often try to recruit people to come and give personal lived experiences about the way various pieces of legislation are going to impact them personally and how it will impact the people in their lives and in their communities, especially around voting, particularly around, in North Carolina, we've seen some very nasty legislation around suppressing the right to protest and suppressing the right to dissent and criminalizing the exercising of your First Amendment rights. So we are finding that it is necessary for people to become active participants in our own liberation, which for lots of movement work has not always been the case. But in this moment, there is nothing else more important than making sure that the people understand that their job as the employer of elected officials is to ensure that those elected officials are doing what they're supposed to do. And if they are not doing what they're supposed to do, that we make sure they understand and we are organized well enough to replace them in the next job interview or hiring cycle. So that is just one way that we talk about here in North Carolina elections. We talk about how people can use the power that is theirs, right? The power that we give elected officials in a representative democracy is not theirs, it is ours. And we are finding that that is resonating with folks in a way that unfortunately it took, a fascist regime for people to sit up and pay attention. But despite that fact, people are paying attention, people are listening, and they are hungry for this type of paradigm shift, and they're hungry for direction as to how to create substantive changes in the political environment that so often feels hopeless.
Michael or Derek, I want to give you a second to respond if you'd like, but if not, I want to particularly highlight Derek, the work that SDRI has done, I think illustrates such a great ways that lawyers can get involved in being creative and thinking about how to do this year round, and finding this niche, because really before SDRI, there weren't that many people working the beat of state constitutional work in general. And so what has your experience been in kind of it's not a new field, but a relatively unworked field, and how have y'all gone about using that work to inform others' advocacy and activism?
Yeah, I mean, the field seems like it's growing every minute, and more people are getting involved, and people should be getting involved. I would just say in general, there's so much you can research. Every state constitution has its own unique text, unique structure, and unique history. And very little has been written about that in the scheme of things. And so I guess what I would encourage folks to do is look at your state constitution, investigate the history of it. You might be surprised what you find. Um, Michael earlier mentioned this Utah Supreme Court decision. It was the League of Women Voters of Utah versus Utah State Legislature. I mean, that's just like a really wonderful blueprint for this kind of unique state constitutional analysis. So if you're curious how to go about doing it, I would say read that opinion, and see what you can find in your own state, and see if there's something relevant to an issue you're considering.
And I just mention like that decision from the Utah Supreme Court was unanimous, right? I mean, like that is like really, and then the legislature tried to go around that by like changing the putting on an amendment in the on the Constitution, and the Utah Supreme Court struck that down and said that wait, you can't do this either. Like this is not, you don't get to end run that, right? And so it's very much, and like you might find surprising things. I will say, like, some of the biggest problems that we have in the country, sort of in terms of anti-democratic power grabs and entrenchment and lock-in, are in the South. And like Southern constitutions, I think, are something that people haven't spent enough time on, right? I mean, I think there's an easy willingness to sort of dismiss Southern constitutions because many of them have, roots that we don't necessarily like, but there are things in there. I come from Texas originally, right? There are amendments in the Constitution in the 1970s in Texas that are very progressive in origin and things like that. And I think we just need to sort of investigate that. And again, I would just put in a plug, like it's not always sexy things like free and equal elections, right? I mean, people kind of look at that, and kind of say like, well, gosh, I wish we had a clause like that. But in Wisconsin, it was contiguity. In other places, it's like equal population requirements or things like that, or little things that sometimes courts are willing to sort of enforce, even if they're not willing to go for grand sort of constitutional rights. And so people need to be researching that. We need to be developing a jurisprudential framework. More people should clerk on state Supreme Courts and things like that, right? And recognize that, like, this is a new field, because increasingly, both in terms of the legislation and in terms of the courts, like, the federal government is not where it's at. It's really the action is in the states, if there's going to be action.
I'm going to ask one more question before we get into Q&A from the audience. So just as a reminder, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you would like to submit a question, we've already gotten several great ones. Please use that box to enter your questions, and we will get to as many as we can. I feel like this conversation has led to maybe a very natural place for ACS and ACS's audience, which is the role of courts in the way in which state legislatures are running amok, for lack of a better or more technical term. What do you, when you look around the country and you look at particularly state Supreme Courts, but also obviously the United States Supreme Court has a role to play here. What is your sense of the lay of the land, and what is the path forward in trying to bring those bodies to be at least more representative of the communities that they serve? Because oftentimes I think we think of judges as people who are on robes and they are untethered to the representation part of their job. And so I'm curious what you think, particularly for the elected state Supreme Court seats, but also those that are maybe appointed or otherwise decided.
Well, I think it's very uneven, right? Like we have 50 states, and I think the process for selecting judges is very different in the various states. I do think it's something that we should think more about, right? And pay more attention to, and likewise, everyone should be aware, of course, like as courts start to do things, like there's oftentimes pushback to these courts, right? We mentioned like some victories, but like in Ohio and in other states where state Supreme Courts rule in the right way, there's threats of impeaching justices, right, or removing them, or or changing there are lots of attacks on the power of judges at the state level, which I think is very concerning, because these are not by and large radical decisions, and yet there's sort of like a tendency to view them courts increasingly in political ways. So, the state court, I think it's something that both is an opportunity, but, to the something also to be guarded. So.
One
Say
other
that I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, just one other observation I have. I mean, building up Michael's point. I mean, yes, there's this just fundamentally different relationship between elected judges and the voters than federal judges who are appointed to lifetime terms, and citizens. Part of that too, though, I mean, bringing back the direct democracy element is state court opinions. I mean, far more than federal court opinions are not the last word on things, and people can use the direct democracy powers where it's available, to basically countermand a court, and that power just isn't there at the federal level. And so it's just something else I guess to keep in mind when thinking through the state constitutions and direct democracy specifically.
Dawn, you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, I was just first of all, I don't know if y'all can hear, but I'm in the office with my team, and the group here at Emancipate NC is a little rowdy. We do things a little very unconventionally, so I apologize if you can hear them laughing and talking and plotting behind the door. So that's the first thing.
Good trouble. It's all good trouble being plotted.
It definitely is good trouble. But I do want to circle back to what we're talking about as far as judges, selecting judges, how judges are selected, and what impact that has on the people. And here in North Carolina, what we're seeing too, and I think that the people have to become much more savvy, and it is our responsibilities as attorneys and lawyers, to shed light on what happens inside of courts, right? That is one of the roles that Emancipate NC takes very, very seriously, is shining light into dark corners. And unfortunately, for most people in America, our judiciary is dark corners. There are things that go on behind closed doors that your average person is not aware of. And because of that, in judicial settings and in court, and inside of courtrooms, we hear and see things that are absolutely, especially here in North Carolina, outrageous, simply because they believe no one will ever really know what is happening inside of those courtrooms. So one of the things that I think as lawyers we need to do a better job of is calling out BS that happens inside of courts, right? Not be afraid to say, even though that our judicial systems writ large are riddled with systemic and institutional racism, and there are rules and policies and procedures that look very innocuous on paper, however, in practice and in action have very detrimental results for poor people, marginalized people, women, LGBT communities, and so on. We have got to make it standard practice to say out loud and to call out the racism that we see. And when we're seeing it inside of our courts, as lawyers, as folks that are involved in the justice system in some way, it is our responsibility to make sure that people know what it is and that we are not talking to ourselves in silos, but we are using language that is easily understood by lay people and easily digestible by lay folks. The reality is, y'all, everybody understands what it looks like when you're cheating. If you say that somebody is cheating, if you say somebody's putting their hands on the scales, people understand that. We use the analogy very often of judges. North Carolina is a big sports state, if you didn't know. Right? So very often we will talk about the outrage that people will have if in a Duke UNC basketball game, one of the referees was blatantly in favor of one team over the other and was making calls in favor of one team over the other regularly and ignoring the harms of the other team that they weren't in favor of. Not necessarily breaking the law, working within the framework of the rules of the game, but using those rules in a way that clearly favors one team over the other, there would be outrage in the streets. And that is the way we want to talk about what we're seeing happen inside of our judiciaries with the people. And we find that people respond to that. They understand that courts are supposed to be fair. They are supposed to be the referees of our constitutional rights. And if our courts aren't acting as referees, or if they've been bought off, or if they have compromised loyalties other than to the people and to the rule of law, what you get is less of a judiciary and more of another arm of the legislature or the governor or the executive branch, which we are seeing now play out on a federal level in a way that is frightening. Someone put in the chat, what do we do when the president decides, when the executive branch decides that it will not honor and respect the judicial branch? That's a tough question, right? Because never in American history have we been here, right? And what we're finding is that there really isn't much that can be done unless you have, and we use the power of the people to elect people to our judiciaries on a state level, and on a federal level it's even harder because they're appointed, and they're appointed for life. But it's important that we pay attention and we understand who are these people that they're putting on these benches, who are the people that are deciding whether or not I get to keep my civil rights, and what are they doing with that power.
Dawn already got one of our questions answered from the chat, so she's ahead of me, and I'm grateful for that work. So I'm going to turn now to the next question that we have. And Michael, as a native Texan myself, and I'm going to direct this to you first, having spent quite a bit of time in Texas as well. We have someone who says, they're seeing a lot of what we're discussing happening in Texas as well. I know that I grew up in the suburbs of Tarrant County, and if you are from Texas, you have a sense of that vibe. Where recently a local official, heeding guidance from the Supreme Court, said, "Oh, we're just straight up trying to have conservative seats on this commission." They understand what the court has kind of greenlit and are not hiding behind fig leaves anymore. So I know that is one example that I can point to, but I'm curious what your thoughts are, particularly Texas and its experience with gerrymandering and how that has played out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Texas is hard, right? I mean, I think, and I talked about thinking outside the box, but, you don't have direct democracy in Texas. I mean, I think Texas, so you can't collect signatures and put something on the ballot yourself, either legislation or constitutional amendment. Everything has to go through the legislature, which it's very gerrymandered itself, and is not at the not going to sort of pass the sort of stuff that I think would easily pass if a majority of Texans have the ability to sort of vote on it. You also don't have the courts have not sort of been willing thus far. It's an elected court, right? It's all Republicans, and they have so far been sort of not been sort of bastions of what you would think. But so I think Texas is certainly a hard state. I think many states in the country, especially in the South, are hard states. But that said, I think it's worth taking a look because again, there are many different provisions and I always go back to Wisconsin and the contiguity requirement, which is as boring a requirement as you could ever get. Like how do you deal with crossing a body of water? Is it contiguous or not? And Wisconsin had these districts that had little splashes outside of unconnected, and that they said like, no, you've got to enforce that. And so I think that there are ways to sort of do it. I do think like it's important to have a community come together and be thinking about this and not always sort of default to like, let's go to federal court, right? Because I think we've seen especially in redistricting, the last couple of cycles, like very minimal, lots of litigation that takes most of the decade, but very little sort of incremental gain in this in a state where people of color provided 95% of the population growth, right? And so I think that people need to sort of think about how to do that, and I don't have an easy answer, unfortunately. but I think that but I think like it's a project worth undertaking, and we should do that.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. We have a submission that says, I work with very low income people all the time. They do not have money to contribute to campaigns or time to walk precincts. So they feel that without those contributions, the political parties have no interest in them. In the last election, it seemed like the Democrats had so much money, and still the people I serve, as well as everyone else who cares about outcomes, lost big. Is it true that the political parties are the ones selling the idea that the voting is transactional? Kind of going back to your point, Dawn, earlier. You pay, you vote, you get someone in office. Otherwise, how do you get power? So Dawn, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, I definitely will take this one because I think it's a good question. And it's one that those of us who work in this realm and at the intersection of politics and race are really grappling with and have been grappling with for a very long time. One of the things that I think I and other folks in the ecosystem here in North Carolina do and are doing more prevalently is really dialing back this expectation that that your vote is going to be the thing that will change your life in some way. We are also helping folks understand that most of the things that impact your life on a daily level, on a daily basis, happen on a local level, right? And so very often we spend, election enthusiasts spend so much time focused on national elections that we are not looking at down ballot races. We are not looking at the way that you can wrangle power in school board or as members of a school board or city councils or county commissioners. And I think that is a place where money is helpful in campaigning, but it is not necessarily the end all to be all to how you gain power. It really is a numbers game, especially in districts that are gerrymandered on a state level for our state legislature. Maybe that's not the way we skin the cat. Maybe we focus our energy on skinning cats on a local and county level and get folks elected to those offices where it is much less expensive. It is a much smaller pool of money that you need. Now, let me be clear, and I am not saying at all that those are always attainable, right? Because it is expensive to run for any office in this day and age. It is expensive, and it is prohibitive for most poor people. But one of the things that we want to emphasize in this moment is that if we collectively combine our resources, even if each one of us has something small and we are supporting a candidate, finding a candidate that believes the same way that we believe, to put on various county commissions or city councils, or even on statewide advisory boards where people can apply and join. Those are places where we need to have people infiltrate who have like minds as us and be in positions of power where they can vocally call out foolishness that we are seeing and advocate for things that are more fair and more equitable for all of us. So that is the way that I think that people can get around it. Like we're just not going to win. We don't have the numbers. We don't have the dollars to win, to buy elections. We just don't, not on a federal level, and many times not on a statewide level. So where the work has to shift is where we can impact, and where we can impact is locally. And so we are focusing very much on helping people understand the power of their local electorates, electeds, and understand that it is an accessible way for people to have huge impacts on their day-to-day lives, and see real change that is directly tethered to their vote. So down ballot voting, down ballot elections, focusing on those down ballot elections, getting people involved on a local level and a municipal level in politics that will have a much stronger impact on their day-to-day lives.
And just to underline something that you said earlier, oftentimes money and politics can be determinative, and we've seen just incredible amounts of it. But we did see this year in Wisconsin that money really backfire, and that is because of people. That was because of people explaining what was going on and talking to their neighbors who maybe weren't as plugged into the, doom scroll that maybe those of us on the panel do day to day. And there's just such power in being that trusted voice within a community to explain these things and help them with this down ballot process. Okay. Derek, I have one that I'm going to direct your way if you don't mind, just because of the Ohio of it all. So this question says, Ohio's redistricting process has collapsed under sustained legislative defiance, executive inaction, and the limits of judicial enforcement. Elections proceeded under the maps the state Supreme Court deemed unconstitutional, and 2024 ballot initiative to create an independent commission failed after partisan officials approved deliberately misleading summary language. When the very institutions targeted for reform actively undermine it, what options remain to make effective change? I'm hoping you might specifically speak to the democracy, direct democracy piece of this. And for those who may not be familiar with the process, could you explain a little bit about the ways in which that process was undermined by kind of technicalities?
Yeah, and great question. And I guess I have to flag two things. First, I do approach this work from an academic and nonpartisan perspective, so I do need to be careful with what I say. But also, I'm an Ohioan. I also, prior role, I was an attorney involved in those doomed litigation efforts just a couple of years ago. So it is very personal to me. I guess to give some background, in the prior decade, there were two separate ballot measures put on by the legislatures to reform the redistricting process. It was, kind of sold as, this will prohibit partisan gerrymandering. And then, as the question asked, or as the question said, when it came time to redistrict, the redistricting commission basically just ignored that requirement. The state Supreme Court multiple times ruled that these maps were violating of these new rules, and the redistricting commission basically ran out the clock, and so we're stuck with those maps. And then going into 2024, there was a initiative to basically create an independent citizens commission as part of that would also prohibit partisan gerrymandering. They had a pretty big cash advantage too, so I mean it looked like it was gonna pass, I guess, going into it. But then when it came time to write the ballot language, which is done kind of late in the process, the ballot language is written by a board chaired by the Secretary of State, and then has two Republicans, two Democrats. And the Secretary of State was also publicly campaigning against this measure. And so you can kind of see where this is heading. The language that was written was pretty one-sided. I wouldn't even have time to recount every single thing, but I think probably the most egregious example is the ballot language actually said that if this amendment were passed, it would require gerrymandering of the state. This is the measure intended to prohibit partisan gerrymandering, and the ballot language said this amendment will require gerrymandering in the state. That was challenged to the Ohio Supreme Court. It was a split decision, a 4-3 decision, where the state Supreme Court more or less said, we're not going to do anything about it. They've got the discretion to write the language however they want. Not however they want, but they've got a lot of discretion. Is kind of the mode they took. And so they let that language stay. And then, come election day, the measure failed by like, I don't know, 7 or 8 points, I think. So yeah, it's a great question. What's next? It's something, as an Ohioan, I've wondered. I don't know what's next. Maybe another ballot measure, maybe one that's simpler. This amendment was, I think, like 25 pages long. It was pretty lengthy. And I do think it was kind of easily twisted or kind of easily misrepresented. So I'm not sure. I've heard suggestions of just kind of trying to take maybe the current system and just make tweaks. But I'm not really sure. But unless the redistricting commission, decides to draw fair maps on their own, which might be unlikely, I think maybe just another ballot measure might be what it is going to require.
Yeah, I think this is a perfect example of how sometimes you might have to be iterative sort of in your approach. And you see this around the country, especially you see people gaming the ballot language or or doing other things. And sometimes maybe the thing to do is reform how ballot language is written through an initiative, right? And that sort of gets you to a place where you can then sort of have better ballot language. Likewise, like there are places where people elect judges or elect judges, or judges are appointed through just by the governor in a very partisan sort of process. But there are people talking in various places about like maybe we should have a committee that recommends people, and it should include members of the bar and and organizations like that, which I think progressive oftentimes have been resistant to because the bar tends to produce more sort of conservative candidates. But but I think many progressives are now saying like, well, they may be more conservative, but they're sort of mainstream, balls and strikes conservatives, as opposed to like I'm just going to be a politician on the court. And so thinking about ways to sort of improve the processes that get us to better courts and better ability to use the initiative process, because sometimes the mechanics we need to pay attention to that first.
Yeah, that just reminds me of one interesting example out of Arkansas, where I think there is an initiative. It's basically an initiative to improve the initiative process, because Arkansas has gone through a lot of legal battles over these things. I think there is a blueprint for this sort of reform.
I know that we could keep going, and for those of who you have joined and may be interested in keeping going with this conversation, we're going to have a talk back right after. But let me first say thank you to our panelists and thank you to everyone for attending. Be sure to join us next Wednesday, June 11th at 2 p.m. for our next in our series. It is called Combating a Campaign of Erasure, Upholding the Rights of Trans People to Exist and Thrive. For those of you who do wish to talk more about the issues raised during today's panel discussion with your fellow attendees, staff, panelists, please stick around. You'll be randomly assigned to a breakout room for a more informal and interactive conversation. The facilitator of your breakout room will provide more instructions when you arrive. And I just want to take moderator's privilege for 30 more seconds and say thank you so much for leaning in on this conversation. I know that there are not easy answers that we can all give, but I hope that what you take away from this is that it is going to require all of us to lean in more rather than get discouraged, and it will take creativity, but it will also take people, and we need people like you to be involved and to really roll up your sleeves. So thank you everybody for joining. We really appreciate it.